As mentioned in yesterday's video, today we're going to talk about the National Card Show and the numbers that they're reporting to the IRS, i.e. the numbers they're reporting around their revenue and expenses. And the reason why we're doing this is because there's been a lot of talk in recent days about whether or not the National is doing something dodgy, whether or not they're cooking the books, whether or not there's hanky-panky going on regarding some of these expenses. And there's a few things here that I want to clarify, as I did mention yesterday, because there's some red herrings within these numbers, and I thought it would be good to talk to them in a little bit more detail. Now, I should clarify that I am an accountant, okay, but I've not really dealt with too many not-for-profits, so please take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. And also please keep in mind that these are just my opinions. They don't represent my employer or their opinions or their views. This is me just trying to give some context to the situation. Now, as I did talk to you yesterday in this video over here, Simon466 Cards put out a two-part video series on the National talking through their revenue and expenses based on publicly information data that they've submitted to the IRS, i.e. their financials. And he put the link to that down in his video description on his two-part series, and you can see that here where you've got access to the 12 years of financials since 2010. And that enabled him to do some very crude financial statement analysis to try and understand how much money they're making, where the expenses are going, is there any relationship within this stuff? And he noticed a few interesting things. Now, I'll get to that in a second. The thing I want you guys to keep front of mind first and foremost is that the National is actually a not-for-profit, and that is very important when we're going to talk to some of these numbers, because not-for-profits act very differently to a traditional business. Now, as I said, Simon took these out of those IRS reports and put them into a spreadsheet to make the visibility a lot easier, and Simon did in fact notice a few interesting things, in particular with the profit itself, where you've got years like this $0 P&L, or the fact that in the last year they made $3.6 million but still made a $4,000 loss. And then also some interesting things happening with their management fee expense over here. As we said yesterday, changed in 2015-16 to now being a trade show expense. And then that number essentially growing quite significantly year on year. He then did a little ratio at the bottom to show that previously that management fee expense represented about 50% of their revenue. And then in the last year now represents about 88%. So the concern came, okay, what's going into that account? Are they funneling money out of the business? And that is entirely possible, but I want to clarify that in a sec. We'll jump to the profit piece first. Now, like I said, Simon asked some questions around the $0 P&L and the fact that they made a $4,000 loss in the current year despite, making so much revenue. And we need to take a step back and understand, what not-for-profits are actually there to do in the first place. And, they almost have an obligation to be spending whatever it is they're making, right? They're not there to be there for profit. They're there to benefit the charity that they're supporting. They're there to benefit the mission statement for them as a business. So I want to clarify up front that it's not uncommon to see them have a $0 P&L, i.e. have an exact revenue that matches their expense. So they don't make any profit, they don't make any loss, it's a $0 flat, and they basically move on into the new year. And the reason being that you see that every now and then, and it's not entirely uncommon, is that happens because they want to spend the money before they get to the end of the year. It just makes sense to be basically saying, okay, well, we have this mission statement, we're trying to support this charity, this is the purpose of our not-for-profit, we have all these excess funds, let's spend it on XYZ, and then that can benefit us moving forward as well. And the issue here comes where we don't actually see what these expenses are being spent on, aside from very crude captions and things like that. So whilst that $0 P&L could look dodgy, it might be perfectly legitimate, and it's an answer that we're not going to have unless they open up their books for us to take a look. So that's one of the first few red herrings, right? When you see this $0 P&L, it's not super alarming. It is common, but it is something that probably should be looked into a little bit further. The same thing for the last 2 years where they've essentially made, record profits all of a sudden, but then their expenses just so happen to match those, profits as well. And it's odd where you've got those trade show expenses like you've got over here, jumping up from being about, 50 to 60% and then, 77 in 2019 to then being 88 in the current year. It's like, well, what is happening there? Are you guys, funneling out money to yourself? And it's a bit more strange when you look at what some of these other captions are that they do in fact put in there and give some clarity to, because some people think, okay, maybe it's for advertising, right? The National has grown so big, doesn't make sense to push the numbers that high. But when you look at advertising, it's remained fairly flat year on year. In fact, 2022 advertising is lower than, it was in 2009 and 10, which technically makes sense because of what's happened in the boom over the last few years. They don't really have to advertise as much because they've only spent 50K, but they've essentially got record numbers, right? They've broken the record. It had over 100,000 people or whatever it was. It's not office space because that hasn't increased all that much. It's not really occupancy because I believe this is the cost of hosting the show, and I could be wrong on that, but it's a bit vague. But even then, that's basically the same number it was 12 years ago when you factor in inflation and all that sort of stuff, that's a pretty good deal. It's not travel because that's not there this year. It's not insurance costs. It's not licensing or royalties. It's not really credit cards because that has increased a lot, but that's probably increased with the volume of revenue. So that is quite proportionate. And the only other thing that it is this trade show expense where you've basically had this huge number pop in and then it almost matches the revenue. And it's like, what's happening there? Some people think it's them paying executives. And that's an important point to call out because not-for-profits have an obligation when it comes to paying employees that it has to be reasonable and not excessive. And if you're looking at, things like that, that looks excessive and looks unreasonable if in fact that increase in that expense is for paying executives. Now, I don't think it is for that, i.e. it's not for paying executives. I think it's likely they're paying influencers, they're paying, stores and brands to be attending the national. I think it's got something to maybe do with that. And that's why they're sort of lumping it into this category. And it sort of makes sense, especially in the last 2 years with the boom that we've seen. And maybe that's where the money is going. But again, we're not going to get an answer on that until they open their books. And they're not going to do that. But one glimmer of hope that we sort of do have is that, Sports Card Nonsense already talked about this. Sports Card Nonsense have had the guys from the National on there before. So that might be a way for them to come on to the podcast and clarify, well, actually, this is what this expense was being used for, right? Because, like I said, if you're using that account to pay your executives, you're going to get caught really quickly as soon as the IRS is tipped off or something like that. That's a really, dumb thing and dumb way to go about it. And it would be really easily, identified by the respective bodies and things like that. So I'm sort of keen what you guys have to say on that, but I think it's probably for paying businesses or for influencers to attend the show, which is going to be pretty interesting because if in fact that is true and that information does come to light, how many influencers out there did not tell us that they were getting paid? Now, I know that's pretty tinfoil, but that is where my mind, sort of goes with that one. Now, one other thing to clarify on that I talked to yesterday is going to be these captions themselves, right? Because some people have been very critical of them about how they're very vague and don't give too much detail, right? It's hard to understand what trade show expense represents. And unfortunately, whilst that is a very fair thing to say, it's not uncommon to see this with not-for-profits, especially, not-for-profits that are as small as the National itself. They typically have very small finance teams and things like that. So you often see stuff like this where they have these really big captions that could be a dumping ground for many different things. And they just use that because it makes it easier for them to prepare their documents when submitting to the IRS. That doesn't necessarily mean hanky-panky is going on. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's bad things going on. It just means that, users of these informations, right, the people that are in the industry that this, not-for-profit is there to support, i.e. sports card collectors, because that's what their not-for-profit is for, right, benefiting the sports card hobby, we don't know how this money is being spent, which then means we don't know if they're doing anything dodgy or anything like that. Now, it's an unfortunate thing, but it's one that I hope they do come out and clarify on because I can't remember if I mentioned earlier, but they were on the Sports Card Nonsense podcast, a few months ago before the National. Sports Card Nonsense covered this video from Simon. They actually had him on and they were also asking some tough questions. So the fact they've had the National executives on in the past, I'm really hoping they can get them to come on again and give some clarity to this because we need to know what this sort of money is being used for. It's not super alarming to see, these expenses increase proportionally with the revenue or things like that. But to see this jump over the last, 4 to 5 years and then last year almost be 90% of revenue looks a bit strange. Now, like I said, my gut is telling me that these payments are related to things like influencers, dealers, businesses in order to attend the show, and this is being their payments towards them and things like that. But that doesn't mean that everything is A-okay and everything is above board because, it does look slightly, interesting, slightly suspicious, some people would say. Now, like I think I alluded to a bit earlier, it's probably hard to infer any wrongdoing here because we don't have the information. But that's something that I'm hoping that the National themselves can try and give us some context on, right? We as the benefactors for their not-for-profit, i.e., customers, collectors, people attending, the trade show and convention that they're there to support, need some insight as to what they're spending their money on, right? They have that obligation to make sure that they're supporting that mission statement through their payment. So it's just one that we need to keep an eye on because those numbers do look pretty interesting, especially the fact that they jumped up, from like 2016, 2017 onwards, obviously before the boom happened. So what are those payments exactly for? I won't say they look suspicious because we can't really see the detail behind them. That's a pretty big overarching statement to make, but it's interesting enough that, questions need to be asked. And like I said, the stuff that we're sort of seeing there is perfectly normal when it comes to not-for-profits, just by the nature of them and just obviously by the nature of the size, because they are quite small in the grand scheme of things. So it's not, instantly concerning and we can point the finger and anything like that. I just think we need the context, behind their numbers. And I think the added transparency will do them a lot of good as a business as well, because, or as a not-for-profit, I should say, because it'll give more substance to what it is they're trying to do. So I'm really hoping, they can jump on with the Sports Card Nonsense boys and give us a bit more context. Now, I don't recall mentioning within the video their lack of retained profits, i.e. the fact that they're spending everything they're making each year, apart from, early years in like 2013, 14, where there was some profits there. That's not overly surprising for the nature of their not-for-profit either. They're essentially there to run a convention, right, for dealers to come to and try and grow that industry. When you're looking at what not-for-profits are there to do, obviously they're there to not make money, but they have an obligation to make sure they can support their charity in the future as well, which is why you'll see some charities retain money, some not-for-profits retain money year on year. And that's just the nature of how they operate, right? They're there to make sure that their charity, their benefactors, can benefit from them, i.e. if they're supporting, certain, infrastructure in third world countries, as an example, that can't stop overnight. So they have an obligation to retain some money to make sure that if there is a downturn, they can keep supporting it. Whereas the National is essentially just a convention to support the sports memorabilia industry, which, would be a little bit detrimental if it was to not exist overnight, right? It was just to stop existing. But there are a number of other card shows, etc., and things like that, that it sort of makes sense for them to not be taking money on hand and spending it each year to make sure they can make each show as big and best as possible. Now, again, I'm not in the super detail of how not-for-profits need to operate or how much money they should be keeping on hand or anything like that, but I just thought that was an interesting thing to keep front of mind as well. It's not overly alarming to see them spending everything they make, and I just want to say that again. So I hope you guys liked the video. Please let me know if you, think I said anything wrong or you disagree with anything that I said. I know some people will come out and say these guys are cooking the books, but again, I think they deserve some benefit of the doubt at the moment, because a lot of what we're seeing is perfectly in line with how certain not-for-profits operate, especially smaller ones. That doesn't mean there's nothing bad going on, but it's just worth keeping front of mind. So I hope you guys liked the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.